All right, well, it is officially noon. I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Elena Whitaker, and I'm the Water and Conservation Educator with Iowa Learning Farms. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. We have Lake Drainage in Iowa from 1880 to 1920 with Joe Otto, who is the Director of Special Projects and Partnerships with the Soil and Water Conservation Society. While he is speaking, if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them in the chat and we'll make sure they get asked at the end of the presentation. And with that, go ahead and take it away, Joe. You are muted, Joe, sorry.
Oh, hey, there we go. Thank you, Elena. I really appreciate this opportunity to present to you today. I want to thank you as well as Program Director at ILF, Jackie Comito, and the Faculty Advisor, Matt Helmers. I appreciate all of your hard work to spread knowledge and information among your stakeholders. And if you haven't looked at ILF's back catalog of webinars, I was checking it out the other day, and it is a fantastic resource for a variety of topics. So please make sure to check that out as well. Our topic today is lake drainage in Iowa, 1880 to 1920. As Elena said, I am Joseph Otto, the Director of Special Projects and Partnerships at the Soil and Water Conservation Society. We're headquartered in Ankeny. And I want to tell you a little bit about me. I grew up in the country, but I wasn't a farm kid. I didn't have the rhythms of farm life to kind of to keep up my time during the days. So I found myself exploring and finding refuge in remote places out in the country where I lived in central Jasper County, just downriver in the Skunk River Valley from where I'm at here in Ankeny. I'm slinging mud and catching crawdads with my siblings as a kid, to camping on the river bottom with my friends in high school. I tended to gravitate towards the water and find refuge and solace from the open space that was all around. And that led me to I carried that interest with me when I went to college at Iowa State University. During the summers, I worked as a corn pollinator at the Garst plant in Slater, which is now the Garst Syngenta plant in Slater, if you're familiar with Ames and the surrounding communities. And whenever the work was done, I would head to the water to enjoy myself. And that's actually how I got into this research. One day in June, before the pollen dropped, so before I was working out there for 14 hours a day, my brothers and I planned a canoe trip on the Skunk River. Our hometown was just downstream from Ames, about 40 miles, and we decided to rent a canoe from the rec center, and we put in at Peterson Pits north of town, and then paddle all the way down to our parents' house in Jasper County. We wound down through into the city. We were dodging snags and branches, portaging around the Lowhead Dam, which I think is still there in Ames. It was very action-packed and treacherous right up at the front there. That is until we got underneath Highway 30 and below the I-35 bridge. Then the river straightened out like an arrow for miles and miles and miles. It was such a stark difference from the first leg of the journey. Ultimately, we made it safe, camped on a sandbar, got eaten alive by mosquitoes, and made it home without incident. Got back to my work at the Garst plant, pollinating the corn, and went on our way. But the straightness of the river just lived rent-free in my head after that. And years later, when I went back to grad school for history, I needed a thesis topic to explore. Some big question about history that was unanswered. And for me, there was no bigger question than why was the Skunk River so straight? And I dove into the topic. I was doing this work in North Carolina at Appalachian State University. If you're familiar with that school, they beat Michigan in football like 15 years ago. It was a really big deal because they were a small school. I dove into the topic. I talked to old timers. I rolled through microfilmed newspaper. I poured over GIS data that I could find, Google Earth and the like. And then whenever I would come home for a holiday break or in the summer, I would go over to the courthouse in Newton and look at all the drainage district records, just trying to figure out what happened. And what I found was that the river had been channelized in segments between about 1900 and 1920. Landowners and farmers interested in reclaiming the bottomlands around the Skunk organized drainage districts in their home counties, and they functioned like special taxing districts that allowed them to pool resources together, plan, implement, and finance large-scale drainage projects that no one person could do on their own, like a major channelization project. My thesis kind of became a case study of drainage district formation and management in Jasper County. So in answering my question about why the river was straight, I I found that the Skunk River was not really a river at all, but a drainage ditch built and managed by people by way of a legal creation called a drainage district. And that's kind of my origin story about how I got into this. Moving on to my PhD, I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Oklahoma. I continued my research beyond Jasper County now. I've expanded it to include the entire state of Iowa, with the stream channelization part of the story coming at the end of a larger story about the growth of drainage infrastructure gradually happening beginning in the 1850s, happening throughout the last half of the 1800s, and ultimately kind of coming to a crescendo in the years around World War I. And today we are exploring Iowa's ag history viewed from the water. First, we're going to look at the settlement of Iowa, the transition of the prairies into the cultivated fields, and then we'll conclude with a controversy over what to do with Iowa's lakes, drain them or keep them, that emerged in the late 1800s and lasted through the First World War. The emphasis behind my scholarship is that by looking at Iowa's history through the lens of water management, the story gets a lot muddier and a lot more interesting. I don't have time here to tell you the story of the Meskwaki tribe's presence in Iowa before they were removed, but it is absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to share it with you another time. Suffice it to say that Iowa was not an empty virgin wilderness waiting to be discovered by white Euro-Americans moving in from elsewhere. When Iowa became a state in 1846, that signaled the moment when any legal title to tribal lands had ended, according to treaties and the American legal system. And the first non-military thing federal officials did with Iowa after statehood was to send in scientists and surveyors to see what was there, to assess the value of Iowa's natural resources, note their location, bound them up with surveyors' lines so they could be bought and sold and ultimately turned into what we see today. The leader of some of these surveys was a geologist by the name of David Owen from Indiana. Owen explored Iowa by canoe, and the reports he authored provide an early glimpse into what Iowa looked like at that in-between moment when it was neither tribal lands nor settled farming communities. In the late 1840s, he ascended Iowa's two largest river systems, the Des Moines Raccoon and the Iowa Cedar, as far up as he could, and he had this to say about what he saw. Quote, "The whole combination suggests the idea not of an aboriginal wilderness inhabited by savage tribes, but of a country lately under a high state of cultivation, suddenly deserted by its inhabitants." He was talking about the bottomlands along the big rivers, which had been supplying the Meskwaki and the Iowa tribe before them with corn and other crops for decades. But when he got higher up in the river valleys, what you're looking at on your screen here, he noticed the landscape changed into what he understood as a desolate, barren, knobby country where the creeks ran through marshes filled with numerous pools, ponds, and lakes. After descending above what is now the city of Iowa Falls, he observed a barren region of drift knolls stretching as far as the eye can reach, destitute of timber except for a narrow belt skirting the river. The hollows between the drift knolls are wet and marshy, and the summit of the hills strewn with gravel and boulders, intermixed with a thin, poor soil that only supports a scant growth of stunted herbage. He was so unimpressed with what he saw that he didn't even bother continuing the survey. He actually turned his canoe around and left. And in his report, he just said those lands weren't even worth the expense of surveying them, and that it made more sense just to keep them in the public domain. He said, "These lands are so wholly worthless as not to justify the expense of sectionizing or surveying at all. Furthermore, if they are accepted without examination or inquiry, the saving to the land office will much overpay the entire cost of the survey." He didn't even think that the headwater regions of all of Iowa's rivers in central and northern Iowa were worth the time to survey out because they were so filled with wetlands, marshes, ponds, and lakes. But the land was surveyed, and eventually newcomers did come to the headwater region of Iowa, known today as the prairie pothole region, the wet prairies, the tall grass prairies. There is a lot of different definitions that you can apply to this area. I try to give you a firsthand observation of what was seen. And there are other experts out there that can talk about, glaciation and soil depth and soil types. So I'll stick to the oral accounts for my expertise. Newcomers did come into the headwater region, And here's a quick animation of the survey as it works. So I'm going to advance 3 slides really quickly to show you how the surveying actually happened. Here's the boxes with little dots in them are the surveys that have been completed. The open boxes are the surveys that are planned. So here's 1849, there's 1851, and then here's 1866. And you can see that by 1866, those dark borders are district boundaries. So anyone wanting to buy land within one of those dark black boxes would go to the city marked in that box to say, I want to buy land in this section, this township, in this range, and here's the money and here's how you do it. So by 1866, you can see that Iowa is completely surveyed and the lands are available for purchase. So at this point, Iowa is mostly public domain, mostly public land that will kind of slowly be disposed of and as it was purchased. Completed surveys meant people could apply to purchase and own land in Iowa, which happened between the 1830s and the 1860s. And really, at the same time, buying lands in Iowa was that transition to agriculture, and also for us here, the growth of drainage systems. For it is the story of managing water to support the expansion of agriculture that arguably holds great understanding and insight into why Iowa looks the way it does today. And drainage systems are how that was accomplished. By looking at Iowa's history through the lens of water management, the story gets, pardon the pun, a lot muddier and a lot more interesting in my experience. And here's a fun factoid for you: the origins of the word pioneer. So it's a French word, and if you think about the the meaning that word has been freighted with, particularly for Iowans, in our heritage, our history, our pop culture, our myth. It's originally it was a French military term for a class of soldiers that would go in ahead of the army to dig ditches. So there's even a kind of a lost understanding or drainage ditch digging component to the word pioneer. So that's a fun little factoid to drop on. You could mention at a party later on. The first drainage ditches in Iowa were dug in the late 1850s along the Mississippi River in what is known as Des Moines County, north of the city of Burlington. Burlington was Iowa's first capital city, having been the territorial capital of Wisconsin Territory in the 1830s. It was later moved to Iowa City before ultimately being sited in Des Moines. So there's another little fun fact. The first capital city in Iowa was not actually Iowa City, it was Burlington, but at the time Iowa wasn't Iowa yet, it was part of Wisconsin Territory. So there's a fun little trivia thing that you can use if you have any friends or enemies in Wisconsin to say, hey, what was the first capital of Wisconsin? It was actually Burlington, Iowa. Can you believe that? And they'll go, no way. Then you could say, actually, no, I heard it. And it's true. So anyway, we'll keep going. The movement of the capital speaks to the importance of water management, first on the banks of the Mississippi in Burlington, and then slightly inland in the lower part of the Iowa Cedar Valley, and finally right in the middle of the state, just below that point of no return that David Owens so clearly remarked on during his canoe trips up the Iowa's rivers. The movement of the capital upstream suggests the centers of power and influence in the state were shifting from the bottoms upward to the interior valleys and ultimately the soon-to-be croplands that covered the central and northern parts of the state. But in the 1850s, we were just clinging to the banks of the Mississippi. So in our search for the very first drainage systems in Iowa, we start in and around the capital city of Burlington, where we run into a person named John Williams. Was he in my previous slide? I'm going to back up for just a minute here. That's John Williams right there. He was from Vermont. He moved to Iowa in the 1850s, and he worked for the federal government as a surveyor of swamplands in the upper Mississippi River Valley. And between 1850 and 1860, Williams improved his lands and gradually built a farm on top of the low-lying swamps along the main channel of the Mississippi, just north of Burlington. So what you're looking at here is a map of Huron Township in northeast Des Moines County along the Mississippi River. And what I have found in my research to be the very first drainage ditches dug in Iowa. So the green boxes represent Williams's holdings in the 1850s. The blue represents the bodies of water that were in and around his land. And those black lines represent drainage ditches. If you look at the citation on the bottom, you can see that this map is from 1873. So I have marked what he owned in 1850, and I'm going to animate it a little. This is 1860. So he had bought more land. There's 1850. There's 1860, bought more land, and there were more drainage ditches that were extending through those lakes out into the river system. And you can see that he expanded them quite greatly, running from one water body to the next. John Williams was an experienced surveyor and lowland farmer who was well suited to this sort of project. In fact, it gained him notoriety as a drainage authority in Iowa. And while serving in the state legislature for Des Moines County, he authored the state's first drainage law in 1862. And then here's a look at that system today in Huron Township. This is from Google Earth from 2014. And this is interesting to me because this is the origin point of not only the first drainage infrastructure, but also the person who wrote the first drainage laws in Iowa. The first public ditches were built as a supplement to existing private ditches that Williams dug himself, and then later pooled resources together through county government mechanisms to build public ditches. So anyway, kind of a neat intersection there. And just as an aside, I think it'd be really interesting to nominate a ditch like this for the National Register of Historic Places. I mean, the National Register focuses traditionally on, houses and bridges and historic sites, but arguably a drainage ditch is a work of engineering with an intentional design. And I think there could be some, I don't know what they would do with it at the National Park Service, but it would certainly catch their attention to nominate a drainage ditch for the National Register. And I think this one has the standing to do so. Just as if I ever have a fun side project, it might be that. Anyway, after Williams authored that first drainage law, more legislation would follow. After the Civil War, Iowa's legislature actively considered drainage bills every session. In 1870, the legislature passed a law that required any public drainage system to promote the public health, convenience, and welfare, which is still the operative language you can see in the code today. Then later on, they allowed counties to hold general elections where a drainage project will be voted on by the entire county population as if you were voting for a senator or for president. It had to have a simple majority to pass. In the 1880s, the laws changed again, allowing for multi-jurisdiction drainage projects that cross county lines, the construction of levees, and the financing of projects through the sale of public bonds. And in 1884, the law changed again to distinguish open ditches from tile drains, which by then were becoming more prevalent. So there's generally two types of drainage systems. There are subsurface underground systems, kind of colloquially called tile drains, which comes from the fact that they used to be made of clay. Now they're made of corrugated plastic. And then there's the open systems, which are your drainage ditches, which the tile mains usually feed into, which are usually a ditch or a channelized creek or ultimately a river. And that 1884 law that allowed for the financing of debt is where we get kind of the modern look of what a drainage district is today. It was that ability to sell bonds and finance debt and then accelerate the projects that way that really allowed drainage systems in Iowa to take their modern public form. Not surprisingly, the growth of the laws accelerated the growth of the drainage infrastructure. And then later on, they added provisions for public highways and crossing railroads, which would lead to some low-level tensions between railroad companies and highway jurisdictions that still exist today, without question. By the 1880s, people had settled Iowa's river valleys and had entered the headwaters and started farming those wetter prairies as well. And while this went on, the state's drainage laws changed into their modern form, which I see as the county and drainage district system, which kind of took form in 1884. With county governments as the chief administrators or trustees, drainage district trustees is the terminology used today. The elected board of supervisors became the executive body of these districts. Everything became centralized in Iowa's courthouses, which is still how it operates today. Remember when I said that this story was going to get muddy? Well, it's going to get muddy now. Throughout the 1800s, Iowans bought land, broke prairies, and turned them into farms. By the turn of the 20th century, Iowa was entering a golden age of agricultural production, where it seemed like the soil had no limit to what it could grow. Looking back at our state's popular culture myth, it truly became something of legend that Iowa was destined to become America's breadbasket. It was celebrated at the time and is still celebrated today as the taming of the prairies by the old settlers. I mean, I can still remember as a kid going to old settler celebrations in Prairie City in Jasper County, and I think they're called Prairie Days today. But it's all around us. I mean, it's very much ingrained in our popular culture. And there is a strong correlation between the growth of Iowa's crop production capacity and the expansion of drainage systems. One newspaper report that I found from the early 1910s mentioned that by that time, Iowans had spent more money on drainage systems than the US government spent to build the Panama Canal. I'm gonna take a drink of water, so pause for dramatic effect. But looking beyond popular culture, myth, and legend, we find a more complex story of disagreement and conflict. Beginning in the 1890s, Iowans started having disagreements about drainage, and it starts with something that I call the lake bed controversy. The lake bed controversy started in the headwater counties of north and central Iowa, where most of Iowa's natural lakes are located. As people came into the headwater prairies, they began the process of building drainage systems. Not surprising. Small private ditches connected to one another, which were in turn connected to public ditches, districts, tile mains, etc., so on and so forth. The broader impact was a gradual lowering of the water table, which naturally impacted Iowa's lakes to a varying degree. The larger and deeper a lake was, the less it was impacted by drainage activity. So controversy emerged around the smallest and shallowest lakes, of which there were many more of than the big ones. The tremendous growth of Iowa's legal code to facilitate public drainage after the Civil War is an indicator that it was widely accepted and popularly obvious that drainage was a public good. It removed excess moisture from the soil, boosted land values, and allowed for more prosperous and stable farming. But in the 1890s, new conflicts emerged, and they had to do with natural lakes and whether or not Iowa's drainage laws applied to them. Lakes come in all shapes and sizes, big ones, small ones, deep ones, shallow ones. In wet years, they could swell beyond their banks, and in dry years, they could shrivel up into muddy swamps or even dry up entirely. These natural variations were not easily bounded by surveyor lines, which determined property lines and jurisdictional boundaries. You know, water doesn't respect a property line any more than it respects a fence line. Excuse me. Most of Iowa's lakes are found in the headwater counties of central and northern Iowa. When federal surveyors went through 50 years earlier, after David Owen saw the wet prairies and just completely noped out on it and just turned around and said, don't do it, the surveyors did do it, and they carefully bounded the lakes by measurements called meander lines. This action set lakes and rivers as well apart from the lands around their shores and banks, and the lines on those original survey maps defined a legal and natural barrier. On one side was land that could be bought and sold, and on the other side was a body of water that no person could own because it wasn't land at all, but water. In dry years, the lakes would contract, but that legally defined land-water boundary didn't change whether it was a wet year or a dry year. It was just what was surveyed when the surveyors went through. A string of dry years in the 1890s caused Iowa's lakes to shrink up, and people living near them started seeing them as something other than lakes. For farmers living near a shallow lake that had all but dried up, it followed that drainage systems could be extended into the lake bed, so the lands beneath them could be drained and farmed. But legally, nobody had the right to do such a thing because nobody can own a lake any more than they could own Lake Michigan or the Mississippi River or, insert large body of water here. And seeing a dried up lake bed raised some Iowans' expectations about what they could and could not own and what they could and could not drain. So landowners and local officials began working together to attempt drainage of some of these natural lakes. And they did so by asserting that Iowa's drainage laws applied to the lake beds, that they were originally surveyed incorrectly, and that the beds should be reconsidered as public lands and not public waters. Some counties generally assumed they were in the right and plowed ahead with procedure, which sometimes happened without incident. Many lakes were quietly drained and forgotten, but others were not. In some cases, a lake drainage action caused disagreement among local people. In rural Iowa, the lakes were a rare bit of something different on the land, a traditional picnic or camping ground, a fishing hole, a game habitat, or a place to get baptized. Others saw them as unmanageable, wasteful eyesores that didn't belong. And when these disagreements couldn't be resolved at the county courthouse, the parties involved began writing letters to the governor for clarification on whether or not it was legal to drain a lake. Anyone familiar with drainage district proceedings today knows that conflict is fundamental to the process, then as it is now. Opposition to a specific project was not uncommon to dispute a boundary, a benefit classification, which determines how much you're taxed within a district, or even the route or layout of a ditch or tile main. Drainage district trustees dealt with these garden variety conflicts regularly and still do. But in the 1890s, these conflicts changed into a larger controversy about the legality of Iowa's drainage laws and whether or not landowners and drainage district trustees were simply following the laws or if they were over asserting their right to drain. And by doing so, not promoting the public health, convenience, and welfare as defined by the Iowa Code. Here's some examples of why this happened. So what were the motivating factors that caused people to try to drain lakes? One reason to drain a lake was because the technology and resources allowed for it. For wealthy landowners not needing public support or to organize a district, it was much easier still. It was just a matter of buying up all the land around a lake and then paying a dredge company to dig a ditch. That's what happened at the lake on your screen, Owl Lake, which is in Humboldt County. I think it's in southeast Humboldt County. The lands around it were owned by a railroad investor who lived in nearby Fort Dodge in Webster County. He gradually bought up all the land around the shore of the lake from the neighbors, and then he wanted to make it into like a giant hobby farm, kind of like a little ranch that he could, he had his railroad money. And he was out there just kind of messing around on his estate. So he bought up all the land, and then he brought in an experimental ditching machine to do the work. And it was highly publicized and celebrated in the local newspapers. Very similar language to, like a captain of industry, like, look at this, look at the great work this person is doing. He's giving back to the community. He's, improving this swamp into something beautiful, and so on and so forth. It was seen as a very affirmative, wonderful thing that he was doing. So here's an example of a lake that was celebrated with its drainage. Another reason to drain a lake was to make money as a land speculator. It was not uncommon for land to rise in value, not only after it was drained because it was more easily farmed, but just the prospect of drainage on land could cause the value of it to rise. And savvy investors saw lake beds as an investment opportunity. So, you hear the word land speculation. What does it mean? Well, here, let me tell you how land speculation worked on this one lake in Hamilton County called Iowa Lake. So first, the Hamilton County supervisors reclassed the bed of the lake as public land and vote to sell it to a Des Moines banker for $6.31 per acre. 8 months later, after a court battle, the banker receives a favorable ruling and that the county can transfer ownership of the lake bed to him. So then shortly thereafter, he shows up in Webster City, literally with a chest full of gold to pay for this thing. Can you imagine that? Someone riding up in like a horse and carriage with like a treasure chest full of gold to settle a bill at the county courthouse. That happened in 1895 in Hamilton County. 3 months later, Hamilton County transfers ownership of the lake bed to the banker officially. So the deeds actually exchange hands. And then almost at that same moment, the banker sells the lake bed to another banker. This time it was a local banker from the city of Jewell, also in Hamilton County. And then 1 month after that, so if you're keeping track at home, that's from start to finish, 14 months have passed. That second banker sells the land to a third investor, and the sale price on that final transaction was $33.50 per acre. So 14 months earlier, it was sold for $6.31 an acre, and then it was sold for $33.50 an acre, which by my math is an increase in value of about 430%. Nothing about the lake bed changed at this time. Nobody drained it or grew a crop on it. It was purely about the prospect of draining it and what the lands might be worth if drainage was applied to the lake. So it's a kind of like a little forgotten like real estate bubble in the 1890s where people were trying to buy and sell these lake bed lands. And here's another one. Also in Hamilton County called Cairo Lake. A similar process happened here, but the person involved wasn't a land speculator. His reason to drain it was as a demonstration of his engineering prowess. His name was David Kent, and he was a professor in the agronomy department at nearby Iowa State University. A self-styled engineer in the days before certifications and verification processes were widely used, it was very easy to just call yourself an engineer at the time if you really wanted to, and pass yourself off as one. So in 1895, he finds investors and buys the lake from the county. Sold the sale price was $3.16 an acre. Over the ensuing years, he sinks a small fortune into its drainage and succeeds partially, grows a crop of corn on part of it, grows watermelons on another, keeps getting flooded out, can't quite make it happen. Cairo Lake is significantly larger than Iowa Lake, by the way. I think this was about, in terms of surface area, this lake was about 1,000 acres large, which is a pretty significant, I mean, it wasn't very deep, but in terms of surface area, it was quite large compared to other lakes in Iowa. He wasn't able to completely succeed, so his investors pull out. He had to pull investment capital to do this because it was such a big job. And then in 1900, the investors sell the lake to an outside investment company. It was actually the Charles Rand estate bought it. So like Rand McNally Maps, like that family. Mr. Rand passed away, and the trustees of his estate used his wealth to purchase this lake bed in 1900. And they bought it for $18.90 an acre, which is a 498% increase in price from the original purchase price of 5 years earlier. That was $3.16 per acre. After that, Professor Kent is rehired by the estate to continue the work. The lake would eventually be drained, but it took many more years. The local newspapers reported on Kent's progress, sometimes with admiration, but other outlets around the state took a more critical view. And some of his colleagues at Iowa State University also had things to say about this. In the Department of Horticulture, there was a professor named Joseph Budd, great name for a horticulture professor, B-U-D-D, called the idea of draining Cairo a burning shame, and worried that removing the lake would make the area more susceptible to drought. Moreover, he thought the lake was one of the most beautiful lakes of all of northern Iowa, and that instead of draining lakes, thousands more should be made all over all parts of the state. Another comment came from a respected legislator and Hamilton County native. His name was Charles Aldrich. He was also a historian, so I've run across his work just doing research here. He saw it as bad business. He criticized local officials for foolishly and short-sightedly parting with their only natural tourist attraction. If the county could not improve her lakes just now, there can be little doubt that she could do so in the future. It could easily have been a summer resort for hundreds of people who cannot go to the greater lakes. Aldrich knew that locals valued the lake as a recreation and beauty spot. Residents described Cairo Lake as a fine body of water abounding in fish and an ideal site for a party or picnic. Over the years, it hosted a number of celebrations, including 4th of July festivals and mass baptisms from the many churches in and around Jewell and Webster City in Hamilton County. Destroying the lake for personal gain of one man appeared to be to some to be unethical and very much against the public interest. So just because a county had public lands on hand did not mean that they were destined to become farmland. They could also become a private resort or a park or something similar, a hunting preserve, that sort of thing. That was the debate at the time. And the Cairo Lake case is important because it was the last lake to be sold off this way. Cairo Lake was nearer the urban centers of Des Moines and Ames than other lakes farther up on the Des Moines lobe in north central and northwestern Iowa. And legislators and professionals came out publicly against the project because it was so close to them, it was so visible to them. Whereas, the Owl Lake example was probably not quite as widely known as something like the Cairo Lake project, and then similarly as other lake projects would have been done more quietly. So they came out against the project and urged the county supervisors to stop what they were doing. And then up until Cairo Lake, the discussion about drainage was very much positive. Legislation passed overwhelmingly and across party lines. Owl Lake's drainage was celebratory in the newspapers, and even some coverage of Cairo Lake took a similar tone. But here we see the first instance of a dialogue forming around multiple use conservation, with drainage being part of it, but not the whole. So people are writing to the governor saying, people are draining these lakes. What do we do? Is this legal? I'm not sure. And eventually the governor had his attorney general look at it and say, hey, what's the deal with these lakes? What's going on? And the attorney general looked into the matter and issued a statement. And what you're seeing on your screen there in the summer of 1895 was the governor's office determination of what to do. And I'll just read it. The policy of the state should be to maintain all the lakes of Iowa in their original extent and beauty. To convert them into fields for cultivation appears to me to be utilitarianism run mad. If by any means the lakes of Iowa can be preserved, it should by all means be done. Any person who drains the lakes commits a public wrong. Pretty inflammatory language for 1895, and it had a pretty significant impact on drainage activity afterwards. Drainage still continued; it didn't stop by any means, but that dialogue kept growing. The state of Iowa asserted its right to manage the lakes. It did not expand government authority because the lakes were already under state control. In the preceding years, counties had overasserted their rights to drain, and people started complaining that outdoor hunting and fishing spots were being threatened. When local authorities refused to hear them, they started complaining to the governor, and which leads to this statement by the governor's office in 1895. Take another pause for water here. Dramatic effect. This assertion of state authority over county authority led to a new contentious function of the governor's office to act as steward of the lakes. The result was uneven management by the state that responded to the needs or complaints of local people who wanted control of the lakes or the beds beneath them for different and sometimes very incompatible ways. Essentially, the governor's office began to mediate disputes between people wanting to drain and people wanting to preserve the lakes. It also meant the creation of the state's very first inventory of all its lakes. So, you make a statement like this, hey, Attorney General, how many lakes do we have? Well, let's go find out. So they surveyed them, and the report came out shortly thereafter. And what you're looking at here is a size breakdown of all the lakes that they found. That was the initial survey from 1895, and the governor found that he was responsible for 99 lakes covering about 61,000 acres of land. And over the next 20 years, much conflict ensued over the legal limitations of county-led drainage projects and the ethical obligation of the state of Iowa to care for and manage its public resources. The lakebed controversy kicked off a period of change for Iowa's laws relating to drainage and conservation. The legislature got involved shortly thereafter by passing laws that allowed lakes to be drained on certain conditions. So 1904 was a particularly chaotic year because there were legislators from a certain county would introduce a bill to drain a certain lake or allow an exception for a certain lake. And you see a lot of those in the 1903, 1904, 1905 legislative sessions. And also in 1904, the drainage laws of the state were ruled unconstitutional, not because of lake drainage. That is just a kind of a symptom of the times. It had to do with another drainage project. I believe it was somewhere in western Iowa, but the dialogue was growing. There was a lot of conversations about the limits of drainage, where drainage worked, where public drainage should work, where private drainage should work. And it just created a very tumultuous period of change between 1904 and 1909. And in 1909, that led to an effort to amend the state constitution to affirm the publicly beneficial nature of drainage. And around the same time, the legislature created a new conservation commission to study Iowa's drainage problems and make recommendation. That report came out in 1911 and included a permanent conservation agency, a state drainage engineer's office, and a watershed-based planning model that broke the state into two regions, like a downriver valley region and like an upriver lakes region, basically with the state engineer's office having oversight over county projects. This report was not adopted, and it would take 8 more years before a permanent board of conservation was created in 1918, which was the forerunner of what will become the Iowa DNR. In the meantime, some lakes were drained while others were not. Some were fought over in the papers or in very heated discussions in county courthouses. A few were physically fought over. A few times people shot at each other over this stuff. And I found one instance where people were shot at. Nobody was killed as far as I could tell, but there were shots fired. And still others were unceremoniously drained without incident. And by the time the State Board of Conservation was established in 1918, the number of lakes had been reduced. Of the 99 lakes in the original 1895 survey, 20 years later, in 1915, the State Highway Commission, which had newly been formed, did another lake survey, and they found 68 lakes in their inventory. And then in the early 1920s, when the State Board of Conservation was formed and began establishing state parks for the state DNR to manage and be stewards of, that initial round of recommendations included only 31 lakes to become state parks. So that's the story in a nutshell. I know I'm throwing a lot at you here. So what happened to all the lakes in the meantime? This is where the story fractures apart into multiple smaller stories about local showdowns to save or drain a lake, with both sides appealing to the county supervisors or the governor's office for support. And it's here where it gets even muddier, and we could spend an hour on literally every lake. I mean, there's so many interesting little stories here. One of the most lovely things about Iowa history is it's very localized, and anytime you want to draw a boundary around a research topic, there's a wealth of sources to go to. I mean, local newspapers exist in every county, sometimes more than one. Public records are fairly complete going back to about 1900. I mean, there's even old pioneer oral histories that were published in the 1880s. I mean, there's so much information to go through that as a researcher, I sometimes struggle to, like, how do you tell a story when there's so many little stories happening above it? So this is my attempt to do that. So, let me know in the comments if I was able to pull that off for you, or if you want to know about a particular one certain lake in particular. Let's see, lost my spot on my little tangent there. So I'm gonna take a drink of water and re-find it again. In the interest of time, and make it easier to understand the outcomes of the lake bed controversy, I have found that the best way to end this story is to group the lakes according to their size. And that's the amount of surface area they occupied on land based on those first surveys done in the mid 1800s. So there's three groups here. There's large, medium, and small. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of large lakes, and then we'll do medium, and then we'll do small. Large lakes, think about like Spirit Lake or Lake Okoboji or Storm Lake or Clear Lake. Drainage was not possible. They had established tourism communities and tourism economies around them, where the value of houses or the value of the tourist economy kind of defined everything. So there was an active local community there to resist any sort of proposed drainage project. And then on top of that, there were established angling and hunting activity, as well as boat navigation. So like no one would ever try to drain Spirit Lake. It's just too big. So that's the first group we're going to look at here. So here's Spirit. On your left, you're going to see the original survey line from 1861 compared to the Google Earth imagery from 2016. And as you can see, the shorelines are not exactly the same, but the lake basically holds it still looks mostly the same as it did in 1861 as it does today. And then here's another example of a big lake, West Okoboji, part of that Great Lakes chain in Iowa in Dickinson County, 1861 to 2016, also holding its shape pretty well. And there are more lakes than this, just I can't show you all of them because there's too many. Getting smaller now, so medium-sized lakes, similar to large lakes, but they functioned not so much as like a statewide or even like a Midwestern tourist destination like the Great Lakes of Okoboji do, but more like a county-wide or even like a locally, like Northwest Iowa, North Central Iowa popular spot to go visit if you don't have the money or the time to take a train and go to a place that's farther away. Drainage was
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
We only have a couple minutes left if we want to have time for one or two questions.
Okay.
So.
Thank you, Elena. Yep, I've got 2 slides left here, so let me roll through them. Anyway, so here's a medium-sized lake. Rice Lake drainage was attempted here. Fascinating story. People shot at each other over this one. Ultimately, it was not drained, but there was a very concerted attempt to do so. Here's Center and Swan Lakes in Emmett County. You can see that the lower portion of the lake was not drained, and the upper portion was. You can see the ditch running through there, and then the small lakes, which made up 75% of all the lakes in the state, were small, and think of like the wetland environment of the wet prairie landscape. Here's Iowa Lake, that one I talked about with the banker and the chest of gold. So there's 1850 to 2015. Here's Owl Lake, the railroad investor in Humboldt County. There's 1852 to 2015. And then here's Cairo Lake, also in Hamilton County, 1850 to 2015. And if you look closely, you can even see the shoreline of the lake still kind of imprinted there on the landscape. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's some research opportunities here. There's holding capacity studies of the drained prairies. I'm thinking of physical scientists, like researchers on the hard science side. I do social science, erosion benchmarks from surveyor journals. There's a lot here that can be done, targeting reconstructed sites for reconstructed wetlands and oxbows. I know that the Department of Ag in Iowa is trying to do some work to boost edge of field practices to improve water quality. And some of that work involves restoring oxbows and potentially, why not take a look at some of these old lake beds and see if there's a viable project there. And then also just the public history of drainage infrastructure and law. So fascinating, so complicated, so deep, and just some good stories to tell. I didn't really, I could have gone deeper on some of these, but I couldn't just for time. And obviously I went over time. So Elena, thank you for, allowing me the extra length time. So I really appreciate that. That's all I have. Elena, I'm going to hand it over to you to do these last 2 slides, and I can take any questions that you may have.
Yep. So if you would like CCA CEU credits, please send them to me, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by the end of today at 5 p.m. And then our next week's webinar presenter, Joe, can you advance it to the next slide really quick, is Dr. Lee Burris with How Did We Get Such Great Land? So we did get a couple questions. One is, what advice would you give writers of the next farm bill?
Oh boy, I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, I know that there's a lot of money coming down the pipe for climate smart ag, soil health promotion, and anyway, tying those funds to anything that advances water quality, stabilizes soil, reduces flooding, would be a good way to go, in my opinion. But my expertise here is historical research and the actions of people, in the past, and trying to help it rhyme, in the present day, and trying to find things that might be useful for us to think about. But definitely finding more funding and opportunity to explore some of these converted landscapes, and then building up, not force something through, but build up local understanding and consent, and make sure there's a desire to make some of these projects happen locally as well, because that is fundamental to any sort of restoration project, is making sure that the people around the thing want it to happen.
All right, perfect. And then another question. This person says, you've introduced many of us to new history. Do you have any plans to publish a book?
I would love to, man. I would love to. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Oklahoma, so I did a lot of this work not in Iowa. I mean, I moved back to Iowa a few years ago. I'm from Iowa, but I did my thesis in North Carolina, and I did a lot of this research in Oklahoma. So I'm still kind of learning the shape of the landscape here, and I would absolutely love to publish a book. I'm, knock on wood, defending my dissertation here in a few months. So I'll have that all wrapped up. What you saw today is kind of a mix of, a few of the chapters that I'm writing right now. That slide about the State Drainage Conservation Commission and the DNR being formed is my last little bit that I'm working on now. So I hope to have that wrapped up very soon. But yes, I would love to publish a book. And if you want me to come and give a talk to a group or an organization or whatever, I would love to do that too, because I'm still meeting people, because I just wasn't around here when I was cutting my teeth on this stuff. So I meet new people almost every month that are interested in this topic one way or another.
All right, perfect. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you, Joe, for your presentation, and thanks everyone else for coming and watching the webinar today.
You're welcome, Elena. Take care.
Yep.